For a long time, working at the hotel was just easy. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it was steady. I worked alone at the front desk, handling everything from check-ins to reservations, making sure everything ran smoothly. The customers were typically polite, and the routine made the days feel predictable. I was fine with that. In fact, I preferred it. It wasn't a bad gig, all things considered. The job was simple. I knew what was expected of me, and I had my own space to work in. It felt secure, reliable. I didn't have to worry much about anything other than getting the job done. But then, in September, everything changed. Management switched, and suddenly, things weren't so smooth. At first, I didn't notice much. New faces, some different policies, but nothing that really seemed to disrupt the flow of things. That is, until I started noticing little shifts in how things were being handled. The first sign of something being off was the growing demands of the job. Suddenly, I wasn't just handling check-ins and reservations. I was being tasked with more responsibilities, more hours, more duties, all without any additional compensation. The work piled up, but the pay remained the same. What really bothered me, though, was how I was being treated. I was expected to work long hours without a break, without the usual courtesy of time away from the desk. Sure, I didn't mind working through my shift. I had done that before, and it wasn't a big deal. But what got to me was that, despite being stuck at the front desk with no one to cover for me, I wasn't being paid for the hours I worked without a break. The hotel's management wasn't acknowledging the overtime I was putting in, and it felt like I was being taken advantage of. I was used to working alone, to being self-sufficient, but this wasn't right. The more I thought about it, the more it started to eat away at me. How could they expect me to keep working, keep pushing myself without paying me for that time? I kept trying to tell myself that it was a simple oversight, that maybe I was making too big of a deal out of it. But it wasn't. I knew the law, and I knew what they were doing was wrong. My own sense of justice started to rise up, and I couldn't just let it slide. And that's when the realization hit me. This wasn't just a job anymore. It wasn't just about customer service, or working long hours. This was about being treated fairly. This was about standing up for myself, and doing something about the situation before it got worse. But I also knew this wasn't going to be easy. If I was going to get what I was owed, I would have to fight for it. It wouldn't be enough to simply talk to the financial controller and hope for change. This was going to take more than just asking politely for what was rightfully mine. It wasn't until March, months after the management change, that the realization fully sank in. At first, I had been patient. I didn't mind the occasional late night or early morning shifts. It came with the territory. But the longer I worked, the more I started to notice something was off. The first signs were subtle. I found myself staying behind after my shift to finish small tasks. More often than not, I was working through my lunch break, eating at my desk while continuing to answer calls and handle check-ins. It didn't seem like a big deal at first, but then the days started to blend together, and I began to feel the weight of it. I wasn't getting paid for that extra time. I didn't mind skipping breaks to get the job done, but as the hours added up, so did my frustration. The unpaid work wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It felt like an ongoing disrespect. I was putting in extra hours, without a single acknowledgement of it, and I wasn't getting compensated for it either. As I realized this, I started feeling more and more like I was being taken advantage of. At first, I kept quiet. I didn't want to rock the boat or make waves. I told myself I was being silly, overthinking things, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I had always prided myself on being reliable and dependable, someone who could handle things on my own. But there's a point where being dependable starts to feel like being exploited. The work was piling up. I wasn't getting breaks, and I was expected to be available at all hours without so much as a thank you. That's when I realized, this wasn't just about being overworked. This was about the fact that I wasn't being treated fairly. And that's when the boundaries I had silently accepted started to feel like a line in the sand. It was then that I decided to take action. I had always assumed that management knew I was working extra hours, and was just too busy to adjust my pay. But that wasn't the case. They were taking advantage of me, knowingly. This wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. and they were hoping I wouldn't notice. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I wasn't going to stay silent. I started documenting my hours, keeping track of the time I worked without pay. I knew it wasn't just an issue for me. I knew that if I wasn't getting compensated for my work, others probably weren't either. It was time to address this head on. It wasn't just about the hours anymore. It was about respecting my time, my effort, and my contributions to the company. I had set boundaries in the past, but those boundaries were being ignored. I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was standing up for the principle of fairness. The more I thought about it, the more my resolve grew. I couldn't let this go on. It was time to take the next step. I knew it was time to speak up, but I was nervous. I had been working under these conditions for so long, and the thought of confronting the financial controller, the person in charge of approving wages, made my stomach turn. But I also knew that I couldn't keep letting it slide. The longer I waited, the more I felt like I was silently agreeing to be taken advantage of. So I scheduled a meeting. I made sure it was just the two of us, hoping I could explain things calmly and get this sorted out. I walked into his office, armed with all the documentation I had gathered, timesheets, records of my unpaid work, and a copy of the employment law outlining my rights. I had done my research, and I was prepared. At least, I thought I was. When I sat down and started explaining the issue, the hours I had worked without breaks, the extra time I wasn't being paid for, I was met with a stone wall of indifference. He nodded as if he understood, but I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't listening. His eyes flickered to his computer screen, and his body language was stiff, almost defensive. I tried to remain calm, tried to explain how this wasn't just about money, it was about respect. I even handed him a printed copy of the employment law that explicitly stated my rights, hoping that showing him the legal grounds would make him understand that this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a violation of the law. But instead of taking it seriously, he brushed it off. He shrugged, saying something that will forever echo in my mind. The law does not apply here. It was like a slap in the face. The law was clear, the facts were there, and yet he still acted like I was making a big deal out of nothing. I tried to stay composed, but the disbelief began to creep into my voice. How could he say that? How could someone in his position dismiss the law so easily? I told him how I felt, that this wasn't just about unpaid time, but about being treated fairly, with dignity and respect. But he didn't budge. The conversation didn't go anywhere. He wasn't going to take responsibility for the illegal practices the hotel was enforcing. And the more I pushed, the more he shut me down. Finally, after some tense back and forth, he gave me a half-hearted promise to look into it. But I knew it wasn't going to change. The meeting ended on a sour note, and I left his office feeling more frustrated than ever. Not only had he ignored my concerns, but he had flat out rejected the idea of taking responsibility. It was clear that if I wanted anything to change, I was going to have to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't rely on them to fix this. If I was going to get what I deserved, I was going to have to fight for it. After the meeting with the financial controller, I felt a mix of anger and helplessness. His dismissive attitude, his refusal to take me seriously, made me realize that I couldn't rely on them to do the right thing. I had tried to handle it the right way, approaching him with calm and logic, with proof and legal documentation, but nothing changed. It became clear to me, if I wanted justice, I was going to have to take it into my own hands. The time for asking nicely was over. That's when I decided to turn to the labor board. I had heard stories of others fighting similar battles, but I never thought I would find myself in that position. However, the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I had a clear case. They were breaking the law by not paying me for the hours I worked, and they were exploiting my dedication. The law was on my side, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it any longer. The process of filing a complaint was surprisingly straightforward. I gathered all the evidence I could find, my timesheets, emails, the printout of the employment law, and notes from my meeting with the financial controller. I made sure to document everything, from the extra hours I worked to the conversations where I had voiced my concerns. I didn't want to leave anything up to chance. I knew this was my shot at getting the justice I deserved. When I submitted the complaint, I felt a rush of both fear and excitement. I was officially taking them on, and there was no turning back now. but I also felt a strange sense of empowerment. I wasn't just sitting around waiting for things to change. I was doing something about it, and I was determined to make them pay for the way they had treated me, and by extension, the way they treated all their employees. In the days that followed, I started to feel the weight of what I was doing. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the coworkers who had been silently suffering too. They were probably in the same position I was, working long hours, not getting paid for it, but too afraid to speak up. I realized that by standing up for myself, I was taking a stand for all of us. We all deserved better than this. Eventually, the labor board got back to me. They told me they would be launching an investigation, and I felt a surge of hope. I wasn't alone in this anymore. They were going to look into everything, not just my case, but the practices at the hotel as a whole. It felt like the first step toward real change. They had the power to expose the hotel's wrongdoing, and that was exactly what I needed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my fight wasn't just about unpaid wages. It was about holding them accountable for everything. I had already confronted the financial controller once, and I knew he wouldn't take me seriously without hard evidence. I had to be smarter about it. I needed something that could expose his true intentions, something that would make the law work in my favor. That's when I decided to secretly record our next conversation. At first, the idea made me uneasy. I wasn't a confrontational person, and the thought of secretly recording someone felt like crossing a line. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was my only option. He had already dismissed me once, and I couldn't afford to give him another chance to twist the truth. The law in my province allowed for one-party consent, meaning I didn't need his permission to record the conversation, so long as I was a part of it. That gave me the legal protection I needed. I wasn't sure how he would react, but I knew I had to do it. If he was going to keep violating my rights, I was going to have proof. I made sure to carefully plan the meeting, to make sure I'd have a chance to confront him without him getting too defensive. I even took a picture of my timesheet before I turned it in, knowing that this evidence would help me later. When the day came, I was nervous. I had the recorder hidden, and I was ready to face him. This time, I wasn't just asking for respect. I was demanding it. I started by calmly explaining the situation again, showing him the photo of my timesheet, and reminding him that, while I didn't mind skipping breaks, I expected to be compensated for the time I was working. I emphasized that I wasn't asking for special treatment, just fairness. That's when things took a turn. He became defensive, then outright hostile. He claimed that he could fire me at any time, that I had left property to get food while on a covered break, and hadn't asked permission. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. He admitted to modifying my timesheet. He actually admitted it. The very thing I had been accusing them of, wage theft, was confirmed with that one sentence. I could feel my heart pounding as he ranted. He called me ungrateful and accused me of being difficult. But then he made a fatal mistake. In his rage, he told me, "There ain't shit you can do about it, so get the fuck out." He thought he could intimidate me. He thought he could bully me into silence. But what he didn't know was that I had everything I needed to take him down. I left that meeting feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. I had what I needed. I had proof that not only had they stolen from me, but they had no intention of doing the right thing. They thought I was powerless, that I wouldn't fight back. But now, I had the upper hand. With the recording in hand, I felt a surge of power. For the first time in months, I wasn't just another Oli. I wasn't some worker who had been taken for granted. I had proof, undeniable proof, that could hold them accountable for the illegal practices they had been engaging in. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for justice. I knew I couldn't just sit on this evidence. It was time to confront him once and for all, to make him face what he had done. I scheduled another meeting with the financial controller, my nerves buzzing with a mix of anticipation and anger. This wasn't just a conversation about unpaid wages anymore. It was about exposing everything. It was about showing him that I knew exactly what he had been up to, and that I wasn't going to let him get away with it. When I walked into his office, my heart was racing, but I kept my cool. I sat down across from him, casually placing the recorder on the table. I had already mentally prepared myself for his attempts to brush me off, to dismiss my claims like he had done before. But this time, I wasn't going to let him. I started by showing him the timesheet again, just like I had done before, but this time, I had more than just words. I had the truth on my side. I asked him to explain the discrepancies between what I had worked and what I had been paid. I reminded him that the law clearly stated that employees should be paid for every hour worked, no matter what. Then I played the recording. His face shifted immediately. The smug confidence he had exuded in our last meeting melted into a mix of frustration and panic, as the words I had secretly recorded echoed through the room. "There ain't shit you can do about it, so get the fuck out." His own words, thrown back at him, like a sharp slap to his face. He tried to recover, tried to shift the conversation, but it was too late. The damage had been done. He stammered through weak excuses, trying to explain himself, but the truth was out there now. He had admitted to modifying my timesheet, to knowingly stealing my wages, and worst of all, he had shown a complete lack of respect for the law, and for me as an employee. The confidence he had once shown now seemed like a facade, crumbling in the face of the evidence I had against him. As the meeting ended, I didn't say much. There was no need. The moment had spoken for itself. I knew that the labor board would take my evidence seriously, and I could already feel the weight of victory in the air. He may have thought he was untouchable, but he had just made a fatal mistake. The controller had cracked, and now it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart for him and the hotel. Once the recording was in hand, I felt like I had the final piece of the puzzle, but I knew the battle wasn't over yet. I had to take this evidence to the labor board. I couldn't just rely on my word and a recording alone. I needed the full weight of the law behind me. The moment I submitted my complaint, the sense of anticipation and adrenaline hit me hard. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The labor board's response came quicker than I expected, and it was as though a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The moment they began investigating, I knew things were going to get serious. It wasn't just about me anymore. The injustice I had endured wasn't isolated to my case. The more they dug, the more they uncovered, and I knew this was bigger than my own story. The labor board didn't just take my case, they took a deep dive into the hotel's practices. They started to look at the bigger picture, my coworkers' wages, the discrepancies in their timesheets, the illegal practices that had been happening behind the scenes for far too long. What started as a battle over my stolen wages turned into a full-blown investigation into wage theft and employment violations at the hotel. And suddenly I wasn't alone. The board interviewed everyone. They questioned my coworkers about their own experiences, about the extra hours worked without pay, about the lack of breaks, about the systemic abuse of employees. As the investigation progressed, I realized how widespread the injustice had been. I wasn't just a lone voice calling out. I was part of a larger story. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right side of history. The hotel's management had tried to ignore the law, had tried to manipulate the system to their advantage. They thought they were untouchable, that their employees would never stand up to them, but they were wrong. I wasn't the only one who had been wronged. I wasn't the only one they had taken advantage of. The emotional toll of this whole ordeal had been exhausting, but as I saw the scope of the injustice unfold, I knew that I had made the right decision. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had been mistreated, for everyone who had been working for less than they deserved, for everyone who had been silenced. It wasn't just about stolen wages anymore. It was about the dignity of the workers who had been pushed aside, who had been forced to work long hours under unfair conditions. And I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for justice. The day the labor board made their final ruling, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. The email I received from them contained everything I needed to know. Everything I had fought for was finally coming to light. The hotel was ordered to pay me and my coworkers 3 times the wages that had been stolen from us, plus legal fees. It wasn't just about the money, it was the principle of it all. The hotel had tried to get away with exploiting its employees for far too long, and now they were paying the price. When I first heard the news, I was in shock. Part of me couldn't believe that everything I had worked so hard for, the late-night research, the secret recording, the confrontation, had actually worked. It wasn't just about winning a battle for my own wages, it was about taking down an institution that had been exploiting workers for far too long. I had started this fight alone, But now I wasn't just a lone employee demanding justice. I was part of a victory that rippled out across the entire staff. The labor board didn't stop at just my case. They had expanded the investigation to include everyone else who had been wronged. All 8 of my co-workers who had been part of the scheme ended up receiving 3 times their stolen wages as well. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride when I saw their reactions. They too had been silent victims of the hotel's unfair practices, and now they were finally getting what they deserved. And the icing on the cake. The hotel was fined, presumably a massive fine. The thought of them losing not just money, but their reputation, felt like a sweet vindication. They had bullied their way into thinking they were untouchable, that no one would dare stand up against them. But they had underestimated us. We weren't going to let them walk all over us, not when the law was on our side. In the aftermath, the satisfaction of the victory began to settle in. I had been the spark, the one who had exposed the truth. But it was a victory shared by everyone who had been pushed around by the hotel's management. We were all in this together, and we all walked away with the justice we had been denied for so long. As I thought about what had just happened, I felt empowered. No longer was I the victim of their greed and negligence. I had fought back, and I had won. But more importantly, I had shown myself and everyone around me that no one is untouchable, not even the boss. The hotel had thought they could silence me, make me feel small, make me feel powerless. But in the end, it was them who were exposed, humiliated, and forced to pay the price for their actions. And I walked away not just with a financial win, but with a deep sense of satisfaction and justice. The ripple effect of the labor board's decision wasn't just about the money we received, it was about what came after, the fallout for the hotel, and the long-lasting consequences for everyone involved. Once the investigation was complete, and the verdict handed down, the hotel was forced to make significant changes. The financial damage from the fines and the payouts to employees was only the beginning. The larger blow came when word got out about the exploitation. There's a saying, what's done in the dark always comes to light. And for the hotel, that light shone brighter than they ever could have imagined. Once the verdict hit, I knew it wouldn't take long for the news to spread. Employees, especially those who had been working under the same unfair conditions, started to talk. Conversations began to buzz in break rooms, online forums, and through social media. The hotel's dirty secrets were no longer hidden. The press picked up on the story as well. Journalists and reporters began asking questions. How had this hotel, with so many employees under its roof, managed to get away with such widespread wage theft? The very things they thought they could get away with had become public knowledge. For the first time, the truth was out, and they couldn't hide behind their walls of power. Not only was the hotel hit with hefty fines, but their reputation, something they had worked hard to build, was shattered. Potential customers, once loyal to the brand, began pulling back. A business built on providing excellent service to guests was now a target of public scrutiny. How could anyone trust a company that had been caught exploiting its own employees? The question was no longer about the quality of the service, it was about the ethics behind the business. The hotel's image took a significant hit, and as the days went on, bookings began to dwindle. They were no longer seen as a trusted brand, but as a symbol of exploitation. But perhaps the most satisfying part of the ripple effect was how it impacted my coworkers. For months, they had silently endured the same injustice I had. They had stayed quiet, unsure of how to fight back. But now, they were standing tall. Many of them, inspired by the victory, started speaking up about their own experiences. They shared their stories of stolen wages, unpaid work, and broken promises. Some of them even joined in with me to file complaints of their own. We became a force, not just in the workplace, but within the broader community of workers fighting for fairness. I watched as the hotel tried to recover, to clean up the mess they had made, but it was clear that they had lost more than just money. They had lost the trust of their employees, their customers, and the public. The consequences of their actions reached far beyond just the legal ramifications. The damage was done, they had shown their true colors, and the public wasn't forgiving. And as I stood back and watched all of this unfold, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The fight hadn't been just for me, it had been for every worker who had been overlooked, underpaid, and exploited. We had all won. The hotel had thought they were untouchable,
but in the end, it was their arrogance that led to their downfall. The victory felt sweet, but as the initial rush of triumph faded, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The hotel had taken a serious hit, both financially and reputationally, but there was still one more battle to fight. For all the damage they had caused, for the way they had treated me and my coworkers, I knew there were still unresolved issues. The financial compensation was satisfying, yes, but there was something else, something that still needed to be addressed: the wrongful termination. I had always known the risks of pushing back, of standing up for what was right. After all, the financial controller had already threatened me during our confrontation. He had said that they could fire me at any time for not asking permission to leave the property during a covered break, a line that stuck with me. I knew the day might come when I would have to face retaliation for my actions. The fear was real. The possibility of being fired for standing up for myself loomed in the back of my mind. Even after the victory with the labor board, I had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. I couldn't let it go. I had fought too hard for my justice to simply walk away and let them off the hook. So, I began preparing for the next step, the wrongful termination suit. The thought of going after them again wasn't something I took lightly, but it was a necessary move. I had already gathered all my evidence: the timesheets, the emails, the recordings, and now, my experience with the labor board ruling in my favor. I was building my case, brick by brick, and I wasn't going to let their mistreatment of me go unchallenged. I didn't know how long the process would take, or how much more effort it would demand, but I knew that I couldn't let them walk away without facing consequences for every action they had taken. The emotional toll of fighting back had been exhausting, and at times, I questioned whether it was all worth it. But as I stood on the brink of this next phase, I realized how far I had come. I had taken on a giant, exposed their wrongdoings, and fought for what I deserved. Now, it was time to finish what I had started. But even if I didn't file a lawsuit, even if I decided to walk away and leave them to their fate, I knew one thing for sure.
Oh.
I had won. Not just in the legal sense, but in the personal sense. I had taken back my power. I had proven to myself and to everyone around me that standing up for what was right, even when it's hard, even when it feels like the world is against you, is worth it. No one can take your dignity unless you let them. As for the hotel, they would face the consequences of their actions, whether through the wrongful termination suit, or through the inevitable fallout of their unethical practices. It was no longer about just one person. It was about justice, about showing that no one, not even the boss, is untouchable. And when I looked back on everything, I knew I had done what I set out to do. I had made them pay.